On a clear July day in 2013, a Boeing 777 whilst on approach to San Francisco crashed short of the runway. The plane erupted into flames and span out of control on the ground. The accident killed 3 people. It is one of the more notable air accidents to occur in the United States in the last 10 years. But just how did it crash like this? The pilots were flying through clear summer skies. Though this approach into San Francisco is more unique than other American airports, they should have still been able to make a routine landing. But why didn't they? Just how did Asiana Airlines Flight 214 crash? The Boeing 777 has become almost a standard for long-haul air travel in the 21st century. First launching in 1994, over 1,600 of these planes have been built across different variants. The plane is powered by some of the most powerful aircraft engines of the modern day. One of the more popular variants of the plane is the Boeing 777-200ER extended range. This aircraft has a range of over 13,000 kilometers, while seating over 300 people. It's an ideal plane for an airline with longer range operations, especially for crossing vast oceans. The South Korean carrier Asiana Airlines was a fine fit for the aircraft. For international flights, the airline is based out of Seoul's Incheon Airport as the second largest air carrier in the country. They have many long-haul routes, including trans-Pacific routes, flying to 3 destinations on the west coast of the United States. Asiana Flight 214 was the route between Seoul and San Francisco. The plane left Seoul on July 5, 2013, for the overnight flight to San Francisco with 307 passengers and crew on board. The plane, registered as Hotel Lima 7742, had been delivered to Asiana in March of 2006, and so had been flying for 7 years by the time of the accident, totaling over 37,000 flight hours. The plane had just been in for maintenance the previous week, and was given the okay to continue flying. Piloting the aircraft was an interesting roster of flight crew. There were 3 captains on board. The pilot in command was 49-year-old Lee Jong-min. Positioned in the right-hand seat, he was not only the primary captain, but also an instructor captain, overseeing 45-year-old Lee Kang-guk, who had recently been promoted to captain and was receiving his initial operating experience. He was sat in the left seat. He also was handling the flight controls on this flight. The 2 relief pilots were 52-year-old Captain Lee Jong-ju, who was sat in a business class seat by the time of the accident. 40-year-old relief first officer Bong Dong-won was sat in the jump seat observing on the flight deck in the flight's final moments. The plane would make the Pacific crossing as routine, as the accident of Flight 214 occurred on the approach to the airport at San Francisco. At 9:55 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, there was a change in who was operating the flight controls, as the relief pilots had now handed the plane back over to the pilot in command and the pilot flying. At this time, the plane had already been programmed for an ILS approach onto runway 28 left. It was, however, already noted that the ILS system was out of service, and visual approaches were in effect for this runway. The airport at San Francisco is unique for the fact that it has 2 sets of intersecting parallel runways. Runway 28 left, highlighted here, is normally equipped with an ILS system. It had been taken out of operation due to what the NTSB accident report calls a construction project. This system had actually been out of operation since June 1st of that year, and a no-time notice to airmen was issued. On the day of the accident, the lack of an ILS should not have been an issue, as meteorological observations from the airport that day indicated maximum recordable visibility, winds of 6 knots from 210, and few clouds with a base of 1,600 feet. In other words, it was a perfectly fine day for flying. Despite not having a functioning ILS system to help guide the pilots down, the flight management computer on the Boeing plane can compute a descent path for the pilots starting from the planned top of descent altitude, whilst observing all altitude requirements and restrictions. On top of that, the pilots also have the help of runway lighting called Precision Approach Path Indicators, or PAPIs for short. They light up in a pattern to indicate an optimal descent path without the use of a glide slope. Keeping 2 lights white and 2 red usually indicates an optimal glide path. The standard approach to a runway has the glide path of around 3 degrees. The pilots intercepted the approach course, the heading to line them up with the runway, on a 14 nautical mile final at 4,800 feet. It was noted that the plane was above its 3-degree flight path. The time was now 11:21 a.m. Asiana Airlines Flight 214 was cleared for a visual approach onto runway 28 left. The air traffic controller had also given Flight 214 an instruction to maintain a speed of 180 knots until 5 miles from the runway. What followed on the flight deck in the next few minutes was a mismanagement of the plane. The flight crew now wanted to increase their rate of descent to recapture the glide path, but through a series of inputs into the autopilot, they actually decreased their rate of descent. At this point, the autopilot was still connected. The autopilot on modern aircraft comes with a number of different options, which can be manipulated with the speed, heading, and altitude reference inputs. On many aircraft, including the Boeing 777, there is a mode called flight level change. On aircraft manufactured by other companies such as Airbus, this function may come under a different name. Flight level change is an autopilot mode where the plane climbs or descends to an altitude programmed into the autopilot. It uses a reference speed to maintain while it executes this change in altitude. In this case, the autopilot was controlling the airspeed with the plane's elevators, so instead of descending faster, the plane was going to wait for speed to fall to 180 knots before descending. This obviously caused the plane to stray well above the crew's desired glide path. Along Flight 214's approach path were a series of waypoints. In this scenario, they were also listed with target altitudes. The Duyet waypoint is located 5.5 miles from the runway and is listed with a target altitude here of 1,800 feet. As the plane had now drifted above the glide path, it was calculated that the plane won't reach this altitude until way after it passed Duyet. At 11.5 miles from the runway, the flight crew then switched the autopilot mode from flight level change to vertical speed. The vertical speed mode works in a simpler way. The pilots simply program a rate of descent, known as vertical speed, into the autopilot, and the plane will point the nose to match that. In this case, a rate of descent of negative 1,000 feet per minute was applied. This rate of descent was not fast enough to recapture the glide path. Flight 214 was passing through 3,400 feet as it passed 8.5 miles to the runway at a speed of 188 knots. The landing gear was then lowered to increase drag and help the plane lose speed. Interesting of note here that the pilot flying did not ask for further flap configuration, something which would have slowed the plane down further, even though the plane here was below the speed limit for 20 degrees of flap. A higher flap setting could have allowed the crew to descend at a steeper angle. A brief conversation recorded on the flight deck between the two pilots on the front indicates that both pilots knew that they were too high, and so a higher rate of descent of negative 1,500 feet was applied. The plane dropped to 2,600 feet at just over 6 miles to the runway. The plane was nearly back onto its desired glide path, but still several hundred feet too high. Negative 1,000 feet per minute was reset into the autopilot soon after, which the investigation would later deem to be an inappropriate response, going on further to state that this indicated a lack of awareness of the plane's position relative to their desired glide path. The National Transportation Safety Board would conclude that this approach was unstable, as it was deemed to be impossible to configure the plane for landing without exceeding speed and altitude limits, as per Asiana's Flight Operations Manual. Therefore, the most appropriate course of action here for the crew would have been to abandon the approach and go around. Instead, they chose to continue. Once passing the Duyet waypoint, the altitude setting on the autopilot control panel was set to 3,000 feet, in the event of a go-around. Flaps 20 was called, and the plane began slowing towards a new speed of 152 knots. The pilot flying Captain Lee Kang-guk asked for 30 degrees of flap to be pulled out, but the instructor captain monitoring him stated that the plane was still too fast for this move. But soon later, the flaps were extended further to 30. Following this was a shift once again in the autopilot mode. To paraphrase the accident report, by design, the autothrottle mode changed from speed to thrust. Because of the selected speed of 152 knots, was less than the plane's current speed of 172 knots, the autopilot responded by increasing pitch to slow the plane. The autothrottle then began applying thrust to achieve its new selected altitude of 3,000 feet, so initiated a climb. The pilot responded by disconnecting the autopilot and moving the throttles to the idle position. With the plane now in full manual control, the pilot flying then pushes forward on the control column to bring the plane's nose back down. Due to the pilot's actions, the autothrottle would now not be in control of the thrust. Neither pilot would notice this change. As the plane continued its approach to runway 28 left, the pilot flying now in manual control is bringing the plane back onto the glide path, even while other crew members stated that the plane was still slightly too high. This was also evident as the puppy lights showed 3 white and 1 red. The plane had now been passing through 500 feet. Airspeed was now beginning to plummet as the throttles had been set to idle, overriding the autothrottle. The crew had finally reached the necessary glide path. At 500 feet, there should have been an altitude call-out by the pilot in the right-hand seat and a response from the pilot flying in the left seat of stabilized or go around. This did not happen. As it were, the plane was not stable in that it was at this point descending at a faster rate than normal and with an inappropriate thrust setting. At just over 300 feet, it was noticed that the puppy lights changed again to 3 red and 1 white, meaning the plane had now dropped below the glide path. All 3 flight crew members on the flight deck noticed that the plane was now flying too low, while the airspeed was now also beginning to drop dangerously low. For reference, at 180 feet, Flight 214 was recorded to have an airspeed of just 118 knots. Captain Lee Kang-guk responded by bringing the nose of the plane back up. The plane at this point did not have the performance capabilities to perform a go-around or even climb at all. Audio warnings and chimes had sounded on the flight deck alerting the flight crew that airspeed was dangerously low. This was then followed by the stick shaker stall warning. A speed of just 110 knots was recorded at just 90 feet from the ground. In the flight's final moments, Flight 214 was passing over the pier to which the runway approach lights are positioned on. The low speed and low altitude as a result of the flight crew's mismanagement of the plane caused the Boeing aircraft to hit the seawall short of runway 28 left at 11:27 a.m. When the plane crashed, the tail section and left engine was separated from the rest of the plane. The aircraft then skidded off of the runway while spinning counterclockwise. Flames erupted after an oil tank in the right engine was ruptured. On the flight deck, the pilots had pulled all 3 of the aircraft's fire handles for both the 2 engines and APU. Evacuation of the plane then quickly began. Most passengers on board would survive. 2 passengers, 2 16-year-old girls, were killed in the initial crash. It is thought that these passengers were not wearing a seatbelt at the time of the accident. Another passenger, a 15-year-old girl, would die 6 days later after succumbing to their injuries. The 3 fatally injured passengers were all seated in the aft end of the plane. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that pilot error in the mismanagement of the aircraft was the primary cause of the accident. Highlighted contributing factors included poorly described autopilot and flight director systems in Boeing's documentation. Asiana's flight training and crew fatigue were also cited as being contributing factors. For a time, South Korean aviation had one of the worst safety records in the world. Safety has drastically improved in the country's aviation sector since 2000. Aside from Asiana Airlines Flight 214, there has never been another fatal accident of a passenger plane involving the country's 2 largest airlines, Korean Air and Asiana, in that time. Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. I do apologize if I sounded a bit off in this video and still kind of do. This is because I've had a pretty nasty cold this week that I'm still recovering from. I am fine though, and I should be well for next week's video. If you did find this video to be interesting, be sure to subscribe as there is a new video every Saturday. I'm also thinking next week of trying out YouTube's premiere feature for a video. I'll provide more details in a community post this week. I must now thank my patrons for their support as always. if you would like to get your name featured here or read out at the end of the next video, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from £3 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. A thank you to my £5 tier patrons, Erin Wilson, Hector Palmateles, Jugis, Ken Zachman, Kevin Connors, Christy, Leon Sant Jennings, Marie Ennis, MG, Pacman7, Panic Chicken, Rebecca Rivers, Saria Melody, So FP, and Sue Shoes. A very big thanks to my lovely generous £10 tier patrons for their incredible support: Aidan Montgomery, Alex Keller, Ann Sid, Daniel Hendricks, Derek Bean, Joey Berkey, Mike Milton, Side Effect, Roger Mayer, and Where Are My Cheetos? Thank you all so much. That is it for me today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!